those who don't know who we are, these are the people who are working on the team, program managers and software engineers, but I don't think we want to go through all of these again for the 4th time.
Cool. And our maintainers.
All right, so how to communicate, use the chat. Again, if you have anything you want to say, you can raise your hand and we will call on you and you could ask your questions. Well, David, do you have something you want to say? Or ask? You could
David,
unmute. Or, okay, maybe that was a mistake. All right, yeah, so please ask questions in chat or raise your hand and we'll gladly answer you directly. And what's the community call for? It's for you. Again, we want to answer your questions. We don't want to just talk about what we want. We don't want another triage just to talk about our issues. We want to hear what you guys want to say and what you guys want to ask.
Okay. And now we're into some new content. So don't have a ton of content for the community call today that's kind of net new, but wanted to share kind of some of the recent decisions that we've made and where we're at and a few different things. The first is what the kind of future release roadmap looked like. Our next major release is 0.5. But we did decide recently to cut another 0.4. Whatever the number happens to be release, which we're hoping happens in the next week to 2 weeks. The big thing that it's going to include is the private module registry and not the public module registry, which is going to come in 0.5, which I'll talk about in a second. But we want to get the private module registry into your hands so that you can start kicking the tires with it. Some of you may have already tried it, but there's some, designed friction into using it this early. So you have to add an environment variable and do a couple things. So with this release, it'll just be enabled and we'll have full documentation on how to use the private module registry. But because the public registry is not done yet, we're not going to call it 0.5 just yet. That being said, there's a ton of really awesome stuff in this release that we're excited about. So obviously private module registries will be in this release. Template spec as a module source will also be in this release. So before this, in order to deploy a template spec, you actually had to do a kind of raw linked deployment resource, which worked, but had some challenges if you were referencing outputs with weird kind of scoping scenarios attached to it. By allowing a template spec as a module source, everything kind of just works as expected. So you'll be able to do that, and we can actually pull in the template spec from Azure and give you full IntelliSense invalidation with that as well. So that's pretty cool. We're going to have the ability to set aliases, which I'll talk about in a second, which will make consuming modules from both your private registries and template specs a little bit easier from an authoring standpoint. We are going to have more descriptions on Hover in a variety of different places. So Tarun, who's a member of our engineering team, was able to get this done, which is really cool. So especially on things like module parameters, as you're authoring or declaring a module or consuming a module, and you want to understand what those parameters are for, you'll get all those descriptions that are in the module definition, which is really nice. There's a couple items here with asterisks on them because everything's been implemented, but we're waiting on our deployment to roll out. We roll out our deployments very slowly and very safely, sometimes too safely. So this deployment is taking a little longer than expected. If it gets in on time, it'll be a part of this release. The Bicep code is done for it. Otherwise, it may take a little bit longer and be part of the 0.5 release. The first one is a function called items, which is going to allow you to iterate over dictionaries, which we've gotten a lot of asks for. So it's nice to be able to get this done. And then the other one that we've also gotten a lot of asks for are functions for querying tenant information and management group information. So this comes up in a few different places, but we've added actual runtime support for these functions. So they're not like fake Bicep functions, they're real functions that you could even use in an ARM template. And this will return information about the tenant and information about the current management group that you're scoped to. And I have a couple code samples to walk through what that looks like. In November, I think we're expecting on the earlier side of November, but you know, we'll see. We're going to ship the public registry, which I'll talk about more in a second as well. But this is the public registry that Microsoft will maintain, where we'll push modules into MCR, the Microsoft Container Registry, and you'll be able to consume in any Bicep code that you're using, where we'll publish kind of known good modules for common tasks and common resource definitions. The kind of two types of modules that we expect to have, at least at the beginning, are things like really kind of analogous to your VM create in the portal kind of scenarios, where we've taken what is sometimes a complicated deployment and parameterized the right things to make it fairly straightforward to get simple VMs and things of that nature, as well as common combinations of resources like managed identity and role assignment, or server farm and website. There are a variety of them out there, but we want to have those kinds of more combinations or solution type things in the registry. And then 1.0, nothing has really changed here other than we've pushed the timeline out a little bit. So 1.0 is more of February timeframe. We've talked about this before, but basically strict breaking changes, shipping type updates outside of core Bicep compiler updates, a preview of Bicep extensibility for things like deploying Kubernetes, as well as the ability to pass resources between modules. We had to push that out a little bit, but we're definitely going to get that done before 1.0. Any major questions about the release plans? I'm just looking through the chat. Can we get an early peek of the module registry documentation you mentioned? I don't think we have a way to easily share that documentation, but it will be available very soon. It's all going to be in public pretty quickly.
And by the way, you can look at our recording from the MVP Summit. We published it on YouTube. The only thing that will be missing is an environment variable that I'll paste into the chat. Once you set that environment variable to enable the functionality, you can basically do the stuff I did in the demo in that session.
Will 1.0 include passing arrays of resources between modules? Anthony, I assume if a single resource works, an array of resources will work?
It's a good question. Yeah, I think I'll add that to the issue just to make sure we cover that as well. But I think it would make sense to support both.
Cool. Azure DevOps tasks. We don't really have any updates on the DevOps tasks. It's not something we directly own. There's a partner team that manages that on our behalf. I know they know about the ask. I think they just have a long backlog. In GitHub, the ARM template deployment task does allow you to specify a Bicep file directly, because they're really just a thin wrapper over Azure CLI. But DevOps, I don't have any updates. Deployment stacks I'll talk about in a second. The private preview release of deployment stacks will not have kind of native Bicep support the way our deployment commands do. Obviously that will come quickly, but in the meantime you can transpile your Bicep code into an ARM template and then deploy that ARM template with a stack. Okay. Want to talk a little bit about what the public registry contribution model is going to look like. This is all a little subject to change. This is what we think we're going to do at this moment, but as we get deeper into the implementation of this could change. Our goal is to use the Azure Quick Start template repo as the source for all the content in the public registry. It won't be all of the templates that are in Quick Start. It'll be specifically the content in the modules directory, which already exists today. It precedes Bicep, or the concept of Bicep modules. These are already ARM templates that are kind of authored in a way that lends itself to be consumed as a module. So the right things have been parameterized. There's enough options there that they are useful in a variety of scenarios for a variety of different organizations. So that's where we think we're going to land everything for what's going to populate the public module registry. We had a quick chat last week about what our expectations are for modules. So not all Bicep files are obviously good modules. There are some things that we're going to expect, especially for the ones that are in the public registry. So one is what we're calling Goldilocks parameterization. So just the right amount of parameterization. And the rough litmus that we're going to use here is users shouldn't have to edit the actual module definition in order to make use of it. They should be able to simply reference it the way we reference NuGet packages or NPM packages and so on. And it's immediately useful. There's not something that they need to go and edit. So that's kind of our rough litmus test for what makes a good module. It's going to have to follow semantic versioning, and we're going to have kind of CI that automatically implements some of those things. But you will need to declare when you're breaking changes and things like that. We're obviously going to have a CI system for any templates that are, or any Bicep files that are submitted to this repo to make sure that they can deploy, that they pass TTK and whatever other tests we determine need to be passed. And then there will be expectations on documentation. Some of this we think we can actually help provide like an auto generation tool for this, but the big one is the parameter and output contract, so that it's very clear for people consuming modules exactly what they need to expect, which parameters are required, which outputs they'll expect to be able to work with. And that is going to be strictly enforced, because if you're changing the contract, you're making a potentially breaking change. So we're going to have CI that looks out for those things as well. You'll be expected to provide a change log, in particular calling out any breaking changes that you may have implemented, as well as a code sample for consumption that we probably can auto-generate as well, but we'll see on that. This is still relatively high level, but should hopefully give some indication of what it would be like to contribute a module if that's something that you're interested in doing. I'm looking through the questions. The what if functionality doesn't really seem to work with modules is something you're looking into. It's pinned in the what if repo. I'll grab a link if no one's able to grab it right now, but it's a known issue. We're actually working on it right now. I'm hoping that in the next 3-ish months we have a fix for this that has been released, but it's an unfortunate problem and we're working hard to fix it. Any other questions before I keep going? Okay. Registry aliases. So mentioned this a couple minutes ago, but basically we don't want you to be forced to author the full registry module URL or template spec URL every single time you reference it. We want you to be able to set these aliases to make the actual module declaration a little bit easier. And I realize I probably should have included a code sample of the actual reference in Bicep code, but this gives you an indication of what you will need to add to your bicep config.json to set up these aliases. So you can see my mouse on the screen, right? Or no?
Yep, we can see.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So the module aliases will be a dictionary. So there'll be 2 sections, TS for template specs and BR for Bicep registry. For template specs, you will provide a subscription and I guess optionally a resource group. What we recommend and what we tend to see for template specs is that you'll have kind of a shared resource group with a library of template specs that you make available, that you provide read access to your end users. So this gives you a way of zeroing in on that resource group so that the users will just put in the alias and then the actual template spec name and version that they want to consume. So that should make things a little bit easier. For registries, we have the same idea. You'll provide the alias name to your registry. You'll provide the actual URL to the container registry that you're consuming from. And then optionally, you'll be able to set what we're calling a module path. in container land, they sometimes call this a repository. It's an unfortunately confusing term, but basically you can have separate paths to kind of namespace your modules or whatever's in your container registry. So this allows you to provide that path as well. Again, this is kind of analogous to the resource group. It kind of zeroes you in on a set of modules that you want to make easy to consume. And then you can just say alias and then the module name and then the version. So it should make day-to-day authoring a little more straightforward is our hope. And our goal is to ship this with that 0.4 release. It may end up slipping into 0.5, but that's what we're currently shooting for. Panaki, you asked about template spec supporting UI forms, lots of customer requests coming in. I believe as of today, we now support UI forms and template specs end to end, and the portal deploys it as well. We're just working on getting our documentation together to make sure that it's easy to do that. So if you're ambitious, I think there's a GitHub issue in the template specs repo that kind of details some of this, but it may be easier just wait a week or two until we have all the documentation for that.
Thank you, sir. You made my day. And this is a customer I wanted to share with everyone, where I helped the customer bringing their Jenkins template they were working with to Bicep so that they could actually promote Azure functions. So I helped them customer with the custom delivery. They have been very happy, good comments by saying, okay, let's go with Bicep. Internally, because of this, I was able to sell them GitHub Cloud. And that's they were working on. So they had a lot of problems in trying to do UI forms because the idea was that they needed to do UI forms with it. So this would help. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And for those who haven't heard of UI forms, you may have heard of something called Create UI Definition. If you've ever submitted templates to the marketplace, you can submit Create UI definitions with those. It's basically a way of having a nice front end for your template deployment. So just like when you go through the VM create workflow or any of the first party create workflows, you get this nice kind of full screen create experience where you have separate tabs for relevant sections and it's nicely organized and easy to flip through. You can basically create your own version of that. It's all described in a JSON file. You can associate that with a template spec now. You can associate it with a quick start template. You can associate it with templates that submit to the marketplace. So it's just a nice way of making your templates easier to consume. There is a question from Axel about where is the module aliases added. This is in the bicep config.json file. So the same file where you customize your winter rules today, we're also going to add alias configurations to that same file. Did that answer your question, Axel? I will. Okay, cool. Just for completeness, let me share what the module reference with an alias is going to look like. So it'll be something like BR alias name and then colon, I believe, and then module name colon version. Marcin, let me know if I got that wrong.
No, that looks good.
Cool. And then for TS, same idea. So TS alias name, and then template spec name, and then the version of the template spec will have the same syntax. So even though it's like a child resource in ARM templates, we'll just think of it the same idea that we do with other modules. The version will be after the colon. So hopefully that's pretty straightforward to use. Okay, let me keep going, and please interrupt me if there are any questions I'm missing. New functions. We are adding a tenant and management group function. This will give you a sense of what the IntelliSense will look like and what properties you can retrieve from these different functions. So for the management group, you can get properties like ID and name and type and whatever's in the properties body. This is the same response you'll get if you did a GET request on the management group. And you can use it for scenarios like so, where you might want to create a management group inside of another management group and you want to set the parent hierarchy properly. Now you can query dynamically the current management group information that you're in, get the ID from it, and provide it to the parent, so that this template is now a little bit more maintainable than what you've had to do in the past, which is provide that as a parameter or something to provide that information. The other new function is the items function. So this allows you to take a dictionary and iterate over it. So today you can only iterate over an array, and if you have a dictionary like this, you're kind of out of luck. This items function literally converts your dictionary into an array of objects so that you can iterate through them in a loop expression. So this is just an example of a dictionary of some football players where the key is this ID, and I can iterate through it by just running it through this items function. And what happens is you get an array where you have a property called key and a property called value, where key will map to this key in the dictionary and value will map to the entire object for that particular item. So you can do value.lastname in this case, value.team, and that's going to be a reference to these properties in this object. Yeah, we shamelessly stole this, as we do many things in Bicep, from languages that are doing this properly. So this should be pretty useful and pretty versatile. Quick update on deployment stacks, and I think Brian is here as well, so he may want to add more detail than what I'm about to add. Our ETAs are subject to change, is October 15th. We're still in the late stages, squashing bugs and things like that to get deployment stacks out the door. If you'd like to sign up, if you haven't already, you can go to ak.ms/getstacks, fill out some information in that survey. We will follow up with you to get a GitHub URL or a GitHub alias to add you to a private repo, so you can get the documentation and the PowerShell commandlets for the private preview. Brian, anything, if you're still here, anything that you wanted to add? Brian, I see you unmuted, but I cannot hear you.
Yeah, my hardware and software is not syncing. No, I think you covered it. I think everybody's really interested in the first bullet at this point, and yes, we're testing and trying to get there.
Cool. Okay, that is it for me. I will answer questions in the chat, and we can cover anything that we missed towards the end. But one of our new maintainers, Stefan, who many of you probably already know, has been messing around with load text content and some of the cool things that he's been able to do there, and he is going to share that with all of you. So Stefan, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. So I'm just going to share my screen. And okay, so everybody can see?
Yep.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. One of the things that I tried to do lately was to come up with anomaly detection for Azure cost, and I stumbled upon an article on the web, but there was a lot of manual steps, and one of them was to deploy an Azure workbook, and I had this big bunch of JSON that I needed to copy and paste manually after I created my solution. So what I did is I took all it was all in ARM templates, and I knew that the log text content was just fresh out of the oven. So what I did is I instead of trying to escape all the JSON, put that back into my ARM template, because if you take a look, let's say I have a workbook here. If I go, I will open the workbook. I'm gonna go in edit, if I go into the code for the ARM template, as you can see, I have to pass all this serialized data. Basically, it's the JSON definition that need to be escaped with double quotes and everything. So it's not very trivial. And one of the things that I also realized that if I wanted to collaborate with others, it's really hard maybe to do the source code comparison when it's in that format. So I thought that the function, the load content function, could help me very much in with this. So I just recreated everything with Bicep. So the things at the top is really just the setup, the naming convention, and things like that. But what I really wanted to show you is that instead of having, let's say, this part that, this part that create my resource for the workbook, I just need to go with the gallery template. So this is really actually the raw JSON without escaping. So I could just copy paste that, go back to my solution. It's exactly the content that I have in my cost workbook.json. I just copy pasted it, the pure JSON, and then from my my Bicep file, you saw what I had here. Oops. Yeah, just need to go back with this, the code. So really the big part with the serialized data. Oops, sorry, it's in the ARM templates. So everything that is here is now just something like load text content with the relative path of my JSON file. So basically what it will do, it will, at the runtime, it will inject the content of this file into my Bicep, for my ARM template for me. So the very result at the end is exactly this, but I don't need to take care of it anymore myself. So it's it's more convenient, basically, if you want to work with people and collaborate, and maybe it's easier to play with a raw JSON and do comparison than having that escaped. And so this is one thing that load context enables me to do, to load JSON file and basically any file that contains text. This was to load the raw JSON in it. One other example that I usually do is maybe keep a small base configuration in my solutions. So maybe I have a project name, location, tags that will change from environment to environment. And I want to override that when I'm in development, when I'm in UAT, for example. And the load text, when combined with, let's say, I will do the same thing, load the configuration, put that into JSON to come up with the JSON object, and put that into a variable. So this enabled me to load config file from the disk and perform a union to merge those configuration from, let's say, a base configuration, override it with a dev or UAT environment. And even I have a dynamic config here, let's say, because I'm using the Unix string to build a unique hash for the naming convention I have. And this can all be merged together. Let's see if I execute this, I will get my final object that is merged will be a combination of this, my base config, plus in this example, I will say I want to merge dev. So only the tag environment that was previously required will now contain development, and other configuration nodes will be merged together. So this is one really neat option I could do with load text content. It could be loading a raw text file like I just did in the beginning, or use maybe config files and do merging. The only thing, though, you need to keep in mind is that the whole content of the file will be injected into your final ARM template. So just keep in mind maybe the size of it, and if there's any very sensible information, basically you don't want that in there. But if I take a look at the end result of my final config, which is an output, and the value, you can see that if I scroll down a little bit, the tags have been replaced. The whitelisting I had for the firewall IPs before was, sorry, it's in there. No problem resizing. Okay, sorry. So I had 2 nodes in the array. It ended up being only 1 because I override it with just this one. So that's all I wanted to show you. Basically, low text content, sorry, open up a whole world of possibilities because you can inject things and play around union configuration together. And so the limit is really basically your imagination. So that's all for me.
Cool.
Yes, Tim,
Awesome.
quick comments from me to everybody. I've actually used the load text context. One of the example use cases where you can definitely use, I have used it, is injecting policies on API management on the product level and the APIs level. So it has been very useful. But Stefano, to answer to you in this case, what I've also seen that yes, the ARM template JSON gets injected. You do get a problem if the total size, which is your transpiled template plus the injected, is more than 4 megs. So we are dealing with that. I do not know the other side, Terraform has the similar issues. So that's something to look out for. But that's a very use case. Put policy files, XML files for API management into a subdirectory and pull it in. So Alex, I do have examples on it. I plan to do PR on those kind of things. On the examples, I'll put them in.
Is there any reason why load text context is being used in the Bicep file, you know, the template side of the world instead of on the parameter side of the world? I mean, obviously we don't have Bicep for parameters yet, but when we do stuff like that, and we're including a JSON object, and we do that, and I know that I've talked to a couple of people about doing our VNet deploys with a massive JSON file of that. We stick that in the ARM in the parameter file because, you know, you get around that limitation because parameters are separate from the templates.
Yeah, I think if you want it to be user overridable at deploy time, it makes sense to add it to the parameters file. And if it's more of just a static value that is effectively a variable, but it's stored externally, it makes sense to use load text content for those types of scenarios. Go ahead.
I certainly would see that for the example of the Azure workbook, right? Because that's not a parameter, but you know, the configuration side, that's more parameter. I guess it's just semantics.
No, I
think that's a
Actually,
good motivation for us to do the Bicep parameter file task that we have on our board. I think that's a good argument because I think one of the benefits you have from doing this in Bicep is you get the type analysis. Whereas at the moment, if you put this in the parameter file, we don't really do any type analysis there. But if we were to Bicepify the parameter file, then potentially we could take advantage of that as well.
Let me share another use case where parameters file separate actually brings a lot of value. There was a use case when I was deploying in Azure Functions to a resource group, and the customer says, yes, I would like to know who actually made the last deployment. They want the user ID, even though they had Azure credentials on a GitHub workflow. So an idea of this can be when we do AZ group deployment, there is a /F file parameter given with a /p, what you could do, override one of the values of the parameter itself with a /p, and then I took the GitHub actor and I injected that in to something called last puller name or initiator or something like that. So that is a way to do that also. I think that's one of the reasons to have parameter file as separate, because on level 3 at the last moment, I may want to use the parameter file, but after the parameter file, you want to override one of the, like a single parameter value, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. I think to Anthony's point, having type validation with your parameter values is very valuable. I think there's probably a half step that we can take where we can link your parameters file, your JSON parameters file, to your Bicep project so that we can kind of distribute all the values accordingly and validate them. But you know, to the point that you all are making, if we had a Bicep-ified parameters file and we had a build step associated with the parameters file, you could have load text content in there and everything would kind of magically work, which would be very cool. I see us getting there on a long enough timeline, but I do want to do that half step first, just because I think that's going to be 80% of the use cases until we have an opportunity to make that a little bit nicer. There was a question about. Go ahead.
You don't need to put in a parameter template. You can specify it in the command line. There's also a limit there, but you can cut the file and put the content of the file into parameter on the deployment time. So you don't need to put it into JSON.
Yeah, that's a good point. If you were doing it on the command line, I don't know what we could really do to help you at that point, because it's basically too dynamic for us to parse it. There was a question somewhere about I'll try to find it, but it was something about with the content that you've loaded, mixing in Bicep variables in there, and I think Stefan, you showed the replace function for that, right?
For the workbook.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't in the code I showed, but I have it really handy so I could find it very quickly. But basically, yeah, what I wanted to do with my workspace is to let me just get that. So what I wanted to do is to inject the right workspace ID inside the definition, because it's right in the definition of the workbook. So what I did is, let me just bring that here. Maybe I'll share my screen again. Okay, just let me know when you can see it.
Yep.
Okay. Or maybe I'll just go into the to GitHub, because I moved some files yesterday and things aren't there anymore. Okay. So what I did is exactly the code that you saw previously in my.
Can you, Stefan, like Control plus a couple? Thank you.
Is it better? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what I did is the load content I just showed you, but what I did is I'll just duplicate that just so I don't lose it. It's not really fast. Okay, sorry. So in the workbook definition, I went in there, and I'll just search for. I just put a token in there, and when I load the file now, I load the content of the text file and replace that part with the log analytic resource that is just above, and I go get the ID basically, and everything is loaded, replace the token, and everything is sent after that to the serialized data. So this is a pretty neat and useful use case if you want to load something and maybe parameterize things in there. You could just replace part of the string that is loaded.
Nice. Yeah, it's a very clever way of kind of getting the best of both worlds of bringing in external content, but pairing it with Bicep content. So thank you for showing it to us, Stefan. Any other questions about load text content or some of the stuff that Stefan was talking about? Cool. And for all the folks here, if any of you have a cool demo, something creative that you've done with a customer or anything like that, we love obviously seeing this sort of thing, and it's great to share it throughout the community. So if you do have something, the next time we have a community call, we'll have another GitHub issue thread discussing any topics. Feel free to throw something on there and we can set aside some time for it. This functionality, the load text content functionality WIT, is available right now. You can use everything that Stefan showed you today. Will you be able to export the diagram from the visualizer? I think that is on the list of things we'd like to add to the visualizer. The visualizer is tough because people just always have more asks for it, and we have a lot of work to get to that Shenglong, who built the visualizer, is also working on. So I don't know when we'll get to it, but it's definitely something that we'd like to be able to provide. Or if someone wants to submit a PR, we'd appreciate that too. Load text content is Bicep only because it takes advantage of the build step that is being done. So the only way we're able to light it up is because when you go from Bicep to ARM templates, we inject the content from load text content into the generated ARM template file. I'm just going to pull up the slides quickly. I think we just have one or two more slides. We have a newsletter. I think we've done issue number 1. We certainly plan to do more. I think the next one we'll do is when 0.5 releases, kind of capturing all the stuff we're talking about today and the past couple community calls. And we will also invite you to the community calls if you're on this list. So that might be an easier way to keep track of it than trying to keep track of what's in the repo. So feel free to sign up for that if you haven't already. And the rest of the time is set for Q&A. So we can keep going through questions in the chat, or if you want to come off mute, you can ask your questions that way. We have 17 minutes of time for all of your questions.
Okay, let me throw the first question to you, Alex.
Yeah.
I do get some questions from the customer who are, let me put it this way, Terraform fanboys.
Mm-hmm.
And I try to bring Bicep to them. So one of the questions they asked was, when we do AZ deployment, what if, and put in the Bicep file, you do get some kind of a syntax, what with a plus, minus, and tilde, what I'm modifying. But is Bicep doing anything with that state, and how do we maintain that?
So the way we do what if in Bicep and ARM templates is a little bit different than how Terraform does their plan or how Pulumi does up, which is they run equivalent kind of stuff. With Terraform, they have a state file that is local to the Terraform execution, or maybe it's stored in Terraform Cloud. But basically, they have a state representing what they think the cloud provider looks like at that moment. So it's a separate state from what Azure understands at any given point. What that allows them to do is construct these diffs similar to what we do with what if. That is frankly a little less noisy than what we do in ARM template what if, because we're querying the live state. It's a little more dynamic and there's a lot more things that can be different from the template that you've actually deployed. We don't need state in ARM templates and Bicep because we leverage Azure as the source of truth. So instead of having a state file, we just do GET requests on all the resources that we see that you're going to be updating or modifying or deleting in your template. And we query Azure for those resource IDs and just do the diff at that point. We go through some noise reduction to try to make that response cleaner, but there's a lot of things that slip through the cracks, and you will see noise, which is things that what if thinks are going to happen that are not going to happen. So you do need to kind of have that in your head as you're running what if. It's not a perfect representation of what is going to happen, but it is still a good like muscle memory thing to do, in my opinion, because it helps you just it's that last bit of validation. Am I deploying 3 resources or 50 resources? Am I touching the right regions? We'll resolve a lot of those expressions in your ARM template or your Bicep code, so you can get a decent idea of what's going to happen, even if it's not a perfect representation of what's going to happen. We are trying to make the what if response better, but it is a difficult, very distributed problem. Did that answer your question, Pinaki?
Yes, thank you.
And you know, just for what it's worth, I mean, if a customer is happy with Terraform, you don't necessarily need, I mean, it's great for them to know that Bicep exists and is an option in the repertoire of options, but if they're happy with Terraform, sometimes it's best not to disturb that. Okay. Bill Wallahan.
Yeah, I have a question about the what if output. You know, a lot of times I'll have, you know, 50 or more resources and I'm only changing 1. So when I get the what if output, you know, it scrolls way up, you know, the stuff I need is way at the top, and I see all this stuff unchanged. Is there any way we could, you know, just say, hey, you know, don't tell me what hasn't changed, just show me the stuff that has?
I believe on the CLI, I don't know if Shenglong is here, I believe there's a flag that you can set to only show certain types of changes. I can work on getting you what that is.
There is a flag called exclude change types, which allows you to filter the change types that you don't want to see.
Bill, is that what you're looking for?
That's it exactly. Thank you very much.
Awesome. And Shenglong, if you have a doc or a sample handy of what those flag values look like, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I can send them in the chat window.
Thank you. Any other questions? Can the deployment function contain properties for scope? So you're looking on the deployment to get which scope the deployment is targeted to? I'm going to assume that's a yes. Stan, that would be a good issue to file. It would be good to kind of triage that. It would be something that we need to add to the runtime, but at a glance, that makes sense and seems useful.
I think we had a discussion around that, and I think we have an issue for it. I'll try and find it and
put it
in the chat.
Thanks, Anthony. I'm just scrolling through.
There are a couple of hands up.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Austin?
Yeah, thanks for taking my question. Sorry I'm late. I had to stand up the conflicted. I was the one that was taking over the community board, and I'm assuming maybe you guys already did a demo of outputs for pipelines. Is that something I should just go back and watch? Or
we didn't do a demo of outputs for pipelines. We didn't have anything kind of handy that we were able to put together quickly. I think, Austin, you're working with Ben Wilkinson on a particular outputs issue. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, and my issue was just that I'm adapting a lot of existing ARM templates to Bicep, and you know, a lot of our YAML is already templatized, and so I'm trying to kind of work within. We already have like a convert to JSON process that we're doing. Yeah, I'm working with Ben, so I'll go back and do that. I didn't want to take any more time.
So that's, yeah, I mean that's totally fine. If it's helpful, we can set up a follow up, just a half hour, where we can kind of all collaborate together and see if we can you know, knock it out in real time.
Oh, cool. Thank you, guys.
Yeah. Any others? I'm just scrolling and scrolling. I want to create a Postgres SQL Flex server. Where should I get started? I don't know what a PostgreSQL Flex server is, but if you create a new discussion in the discussions tab of the repo, I'm sure someone knows what that is and can help you get started. And if you have issues, if the deployment's not working and you have those errors, that's even more helpful to get you going.
There's one more hand up. Bill?
I think Bill got his question answered.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I'll pull it down.
All good. Is there any performance benefit from deploying things like subnets with child resources versus the resource properties of what would be the parent resource? So the VNet subnets issue in particular is I mean, worth discussing. In general, the answer is no. There shouldn't be a performance benefit. I mean, maybe a little bit faster if you did it in a single put versus several resource puts, but it should be relatively negligible. With subnets in particular, there's an issue with how the networking resources are modeled, where if you have your subnets as child resources and you redeploy, the VNet is going to attempt to delete those subnets and then recreate them, which is an unfortunate consequence of how things have been designed. It's a really old API. It's one of the older APIs in Azure. We are slowly but surely trying to chip away to come up with an API redesign for that. But in the meantime, you should deploy your subnets in the array property of the VNet, not as a separate child resource. Almost universally, that will end up being easier for you to manage. There are very particular cases where you may want to do it as a separate resource. Chris.
Yeah, I threw I've got a GitHub on that particular issue, both from the ARM side and the Bicep side, and it's passing in a JSON object of the subnet array to get around that stuff, and it works without dropping the subnets. The first version of it did it just using, you know, an array of subnets and IP addresses, so they did disappear, and then did the subnets in a sub module. But I've got a further refinement of it that does it all in one pass using looping in the variable file in a var to actually build up all those subnets. It's ugly as all get out, but it works.
Yeah, that is the key. If you can have a source for all the subnets for a particular VNet, whether that's in the Bicep code or with things like load text content or parameters files, you can have it externally. And then when you deploy the VNet, you can be sure that all the subnets are there and things won't get deleted. It is obviously not ideal, but that's the best way to do it today.
So this does bring up this one monster point of when we have ARM resources and they have these sub-modules, you know, these sub-resources within them, and you do a general deploy, the ARM template is going to make everything in Azure look like your current deploy. And it would be completely wonderful to be able to say, this sub-resource adds to the resources that are in there or removes a resource versus make it all look like this single ARM template. And I know that's a monster change to how ARM works, but that would be very nice.
So the issue is that in this particular case, the subnet is represented in both the parent resource and as a separate child resource. So a different example would be like SQL servers. You have SQL servers and you have databases, which are a child resource. You can have n number of databases deployed as child resources, and you can redeploy that parent SQL server and nothing will get out of whack. It's because VNet thinks that you're deploying a VNet with no subnets that leads to this particular issue. In general, if they're cleanly separated, where they're only represented as a child resource or only represented as a property in the parent, you don't get into this sort of situation.
Well, but on the VNet side, you can't have an ARM template that deploys a VNet with one subnet and an ARM template that deploys the VNet with a different subnet. You can't run them both at once because it's going to say, you only want one subnet. So it's almost like you need an incremental mode for the sub resource as opposed to the resource group.
I think, to be honest, for that particular case, subnets should not be in the VNet at all. I think subnets should only be child resources, and then you just deploy them separately, and you can deploy a VNet and 3 subnets in one file and 5 subnets in another file, and nothing's going to cancel each other out.
And in general, is that the philosophy that is going down with this approach? I know that something that I've been working on recently is the Azure Firewall policies, and they are policies associated with there's a hierarchy and all that stuff. And the challenge with that is that you can change the name of a policy and it deploys it, and it thinks, oh, it's a new policy, and it deploys it. It doesn't get rid of the other one. So while you can do this and you have that separation now of all that, there's no way in ARM to delete one.
Until we have deployment stacks, and Stan took the words out of my mouth. So for what you're describing, if you want to do a declarative delete, which is what we sometimes call it, you'll have what you want in your Bicep code or your ARM template. And if you want to remove one of those things, you will remove it from your code, and the act of redeploying the stack, you'll be given the option of either purging, which is deleting the resource, or detaching it from the management of the stack, which would leave it where it is, but we won't be managing it.
But that only works with deployment stacks.
Correct. We are expecting that most people will move to deployment stacks. There shouldn't be anything that you get from deployments that you can't get from deployment stacks. Does that sound like it'll work okay?
I think, yeah, I mean, it does mean that it doesn't work for imperative deployments or single puts. So then, like, it changes some of the other scenarios downstream, but I think that's one of the closest things that we have to the solution. So it'd be interesting to keep thinking about it and see if that model works. Because I think you're touching on some places where it's not perfect. I don't know if we have a perfect solution for it though. Because even in the case where, like, if you use a stack, it requires that the RP would then tear down the resources in the same way that it would set a declaration for for a different set of resources, which seems like it should hold true, but I don't know the way all these RPs are handling them behind the scenes. Conceptually, it works.
But yeah, I mean, to Brian's point, I think we're hoping a bunch of this is solved with stacks. It probably will not be universally solved with stacks, so it'll be good to share as much feedback as possible on that.
Something new to learn this weekend.
Yeah, well, it's not available yet, so hopefully in a couple of weeks we can get you access to it. Seth asked if there's a list of these troublesome scenarios. Subnet VNet is definitely the first one that comes to mind. Key vault access policies is another one that's tricky. The other ones are like arrays of objects in parent resources, where if you want to kind of have separate life cycles for those, it gets a little tricky because there's only one source of truth on them. I think like Cosmos DB has a property like that for locations and things like that.
And team, here's another tricky one that I'm working on. It's a bit of a struggle. I've been working on Synapse Analytics Workspace and Sentinel deployments with Biceps. Is where you have to take one of the user principal ID, maybe yourself or somebody who has a tenant right contributor, use that object ID and allow with managed identity to that person or that identity have right access to the SQL pool that is going inside your Synapse Analytics. So it's complicated. Sometimes it works, so I'm having difficulty with that also. So I think there is a confusion in the community where identity and access management they're trying to do with ARM and Bicep, whether I do believe that because it is not a resource manager thing, it's an Azure AD identity thing, it should be left alone to do with actually just plain AZCLI.
Yeah, I think managing AAD is a larger topic. There are certain things like role assignments that you can do that are adjacent to that. And then with extensibility and the ability to talk to Graph directly with Bicep, there's a lot of scenarios that will open up for querying AAD and getting information about all sorts of things, creating service principals and all that sort of stuff. So we're hoping that kind of changes the calculus on some of these things too. But if you have any particular issues, Pinaki, that you want to discuss further, feel free to open up an issue or a discussion on that one.
Sure, thank you.
Cool. We are 1 minute over. Any last burning questions? Stan, on nested loops, we don't have any updates. We still want to do it. It's just not high enough on the priority list at the moment. Any last questions? Okay. Thank you everyone for joining. It is genuinely amazing to see so many people on these community calls every month. I was expecting like 5 people to show up at the first one, so this is very cool. It's great to see all the activity. Look out for the next Bicep release in a couple weeks, and we will see you at the next community call. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.